It happened so fast that even now I can still feel the grip of his tiny fingers pressing into my arm. The room was filled with laughter, the kind that only happens when people are pretending to be happy. Plates clinked, glasses touched, and roasted chicken filled the air with its sweet aroma. My son sat at the head of the table, smiling too wide, his wife serving mashed potatoes like nothing was wrong. And then, out of nowhere, my 7-year-old grandson leaned toward me, his eyes wide with fear that didn't belong on a child's face. His voice was barely a whisper when he said, "Grandma, you're in danger. You need to leave now." For a second, I thought I misheard him. I smiled nervously and asked, "What are you talking about, sweetheart?" He just shook his head, his little hand trembling in mine, and said again, "Please, just trust me." The room felt heavier all of a sudden, the air too thick to breathe. My fork hovered mid-air, and as I slowly placed it back on my plate, I noticed something strange. Everyone had gone quiet. All eyes were on me. My son's smile faltered, his wife's hand froze mid-pour as the red wine streamed over the rim of my glass. I looked from one face to another, searching for an answer that no one wanted to give. And in that moment, an unfamiliar fear crept into my chest. What could possibly make my grandson so afraid? What was happening that he could sense before I did? It was supposed to be a peaceful family dinner, one of those rare nights where generations sit together, talk about school plays and vacations. Yet somehow, something had shifted. I could feel it but couldn't name it. If I had walked out right then, maybe things would have been different. Maybe I wouldn't have found out what they were planning. But I stayed and everything changed. And trust me, you'll want to hear what came next. Because the truth that surfaced after that night left even the police stunned. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. If you don't, you might never know how close ordinary families can come to hiding something that could destroy a life. Looking back now, I can still remember how it all began. Though at the time, it felt so harmless, so ordinary. It was a few months before that dinner, right after my husband passed away. The house we had built together for over 40 years felt unbearably empty, every room echoing with the kind of silence that hurts. My son, David, had insisted I shouldn't be alone. He said, "Mom, just come stay with us for a while. We have the guest house out back. You'll love it. You can help with Ethan, and it'll give us all some time together again." I hesitated at first. I didn't want to feel like a burden, but he sounded sincere. I packed a few boxes of clothes, some family photos, and the old recipe book my husband and I used to flip through on Sunday mornings, and I moved in. At first, everything felt warm and welcoming. Ethan was thrilled. He ran to me every morning before school, his little backpack bouncing as he called out, "Grandma, you're coming to drop me off today, right?" Those moments melted my heart. We spent our afternoons baking cookies, laughing at flour on our noses, and making up bedtime stories that always ended with him saving the world. For a while, I thought this was what healing looked like: quiet days spent in the garden, soft music drifting from the kitchen, and the joy of hearing a child's laughter again. But then there was Megan. She was polite enough, always smiling when David was around, but her eyes told another story. I noticed it during dinner, once a sigh that escaped too sharply when I offered to help clean up, a forced smile when Ethan hugged me too tightly, little things that didn't make sense until much later. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that maybe grief was making me too sensitive, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Then one afternoon, while I was watering the flowers near the kitchen window, I heard voices from inside. Megan's voice was hushed, sharp around the edges. Once it's signed, she won't know what hit her. I froze, the watering can heavy in my hand. David's voice followed, lower, almost cautious. I couldn't make out every word, just enough to sting. Something about papers, timing, and it'll look natural. My heart began to race, but I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe they were talking about insurance, or taxes, or something that had nothing to do with me. I brushed it off, desperate to believe my own family wouldn't keep secrets from me. Later that evening, when Megan smiled and asked if I wanted tea, I smiled back as if I hadn't heard anything at all. But deep down, A tiny crack had formed in the trust I had always given them. And though I didn't know it yet, that moment by the window was the first warning I ignored, a whisper of what was waiting on the horizon, the kind of truth that can change everything you think you know about love and family. The weeks that followed felt almost too peaceful, the kind of calm that makes you uneasy without knowing why. David had become unusually attentive, dropping by my little guest house every morning with flowers from the store or muffins he said Megan baked. He'd sit on the porch with me, asking about my sleep, my appetite, my health questions he hadn't asked in years. It was touching at first, the kind of attention every mother hopes for from her grown child, but something in his tone felt rehearsed, as if each word was practiced before he spoke it. Megan, on the other hand, was sweet in her own way, but always had a purpose behind her kindness. She started stopping by too, usually holding a stack of papers or her tablet. "Mom," she'd say with that polished smile, "these are just a few maintenance documents for the property routine stuff. It'll make things easier for us when we're updating the insurance. You don't even have to read through it all, just sign here and here." I remember laughing lightly, telling her, "Sweetheart, I may be old, but my eyesight works just fine." I promised to look through them later, and she didn't press, not that day, anyway. But afterward, she watched me differently, measuring my reactions whenever the subject of property or finances came up. Ethan, meanwhile, wasn't himself anymore. The boy who used to chatter nonstop about his science projects and favorite cartoons had turned quiet, withdrawn. I'd find him sitting by the window, staring out at nothing, his little face troubled in a way no 7-year-olds should be. When I asked if something was wrong, he'd shrug and say he was just tired. One rainy night, I heard muffled sounds from down the hall, tiny sobs that cut straight through the stillness. I went to his room and found him curled up under the blanket, shoulders trembling. I sat beside him, smoothing his hair gently. "Ethan, honey, what's wrong?" He hesitated, then whispered so softly I almost missed it. "I heard Mommy say something bad's going to happen soon." My heart skipped. I leaned closer. "Something bad? What do you mean, sweetheart?" But he shook his head, his little hands clutching the blanket. "I can't say. She'll be mad." I didn't press him, not that night. Instead, I held him close until he fell asleep, the thunder echoing faintly outside. When I returned to my room, I couldn't shake his words. "Something bad's going to happen soon." Those words replayed in my mind like a haunting tune. That's when I began writing everything down, every strange look, every odd conversation, every unexpected gesture. I filled pages of a small, leather-bound notebook my husband once gave me. Maybe I didn't know what was happening yet, but I could feel it in my bones. The truth was drawing closer, and if I wanted to survive whatever was coming, I had to start paying attention. The days slipped by quietly after that stormy night. Yet the air in the house felt heavier, like the calm before something you couldn't see but could feel creeping closer. I'd grown more cautious, keeping my little leather-bound journal tucked beneath my pillow, writing in it each morning before sunrise. Every word felt like a small act of self-preservation. Then one afternoon, as I was tending to the potted plants on my porch, my phone rang. Megan's name flashed across the screen. I hesitated before answering. "Mom," she said, her voice unusually cheerful. "We're having a special dinner tomorrow, family only. You have to come." There was a pause, the kind that lingers too long to feel natural. "A special dinner?" I asked slowly. "What's the occasion?" "Oh, nothing major," she replied, with a soft laugh that didn't sound real. "Just appreciation. You've done so much for us, and we thought it'd be nice to have an evening together. No excuses, okay?" Before I could answer, I heard David's voice faintly in the background, firm, insistent. Then he came on the line. "Mom," he said, tone clipped, "it's important. Don't make excuses this time. We'll pick you up at 6. Something in his voice made me uneasy. It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in concern. When I hung up, I sat there for a long moment, phone in my lap, staring out at the quiet garden. The last time my son had spoken to me like that was when he'd wanted me to sign those so-called routine papers. I tried to convince myself it was just a family dinner that maybe I was overthinking, but deep down, I knew better. Later that evening, I told Ethan about the dinner. He froze mid-bite at the kitchen table, his small fork trembling in his hand. A family dinner? He repeated softly. His eyes darted to the door, then back to me. Do you have to go, Grandma? The question hit me harder than I expected. Well, yes, sweetheart. Why wouldn't I? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down, pushing his food around his plate. Finally, he whispered, Just be careful, okay? I reached over and touched his hand. It was cold, clammy, the kind of fear that doesn't come from childish imagination. Ethan, I said gently, is there something you're not telling me? But before he could respond, Megan's voice called from the living room, sharp and commanding. Ethan, bedtime. He flinched, slipped off the chair, and gave me one last look, eyes full of something I couldn't quite name, before hurrying off. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house made my heart pound faster. Around midnight, I heard a faint sound, a slow, deliberate click. I turned toward the door, eyes narrowing. It stood slightly open, though I was certain I had locked it before bed. I stared at that crack of darkness for what felt like forever, the faint breeze from the hallway brushing against my cheek. My pulse thudded in my ears. I rose quietly and checked the hallway, but there was no one there. Still, something inside me shifted. The unease that had been whispering for days was now screaming, "Pay attention!" As I returned to bed, I whispered to myself, if something feels wrong tonight, I'll listen to my instincts. Because deep down, I knew this dinner wasn't just a gathering. It was the beginning of something far darker. The evening carried a strange kind of quiet, the kind that presses against your chest and makes every sound feel louder than it should. I remember standing in front of the mirror in my guest house, smoothing the folds of my dress, trying to convince myself this dinner was nothing unusual. But deep down, something inside me whispered otherwise. I could feel it, a tightness in the air, a stillness that didn't belong. When I stepped outside, David was already waiting by the car, smiling too wide. "You look beautiful, Mom," he said, opening the door for me. His voice was warm, but his hands on the steering wheel told a different story, his knuckles pale from gripping too hard. We drove in silence most of the way, exchanging small talk that didn't mean anything. The house came into view, glowing softly through the windows. It looked almost peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the light inside wasn't welcoming. It felt like a stage waiting for a performance. When I walked in, Megan greeted me with that same polished smile. "Mom, you made it," she said, kissing the air near my cheek. The table was perfect, candles, flowers, the best silverware. David pulled out my chair. "Sit, relax," he said, his tone smooth, practiced. I noticed Ethan sitting at the far end of the table, quiet, eyes down. When he looked up, there was fear behind those eyes, fear no child should ever know. I smiled gently, hoping to ease him, but he just stared, frozen. Something wasn't right. Dinner began with laughter that sounded forced. Every sentence felt rehearsed. Megan poured wine for everyone, her movements graceful but deliberate. When she reached my glass, I placed my hand over it. "That's enough, dear," I said softly. She laughed lightly, the sound too sharp. "Oh, nonsense, it's a celebration," she said, filling it anyway. David kept talking about work, about renovations, about how lucky I was to be with them. But his words felt heavy, like they were meant to distract me from something else. The candles flickered, casting long shadows across the table, and I suddenly realized how still the house had become. Even the clock seemed to pause. Ethan barely touched his food. His fork scraped against the plate, a small sound that echoed louder than it should. He kept looking between his parents and me, his small shoulders tense. I asked him if everything was all right. He didn't answer. He just stared, eyes glistening, and bit his lip. Megan smiled from across the table. "He's just tired," she said quickly. But I knew that look, the kind of silence that hides something. Then, as David began another story, Ethan moved suddenly. His small hand reached across the table and grabbed my wrist, tight enough to startle me. His voice trembled when he spoke, just loud enough for me to hear. "Grandma," he whispered, "you're in danger. You need to leave now." My heart stopped. I froze, staring at him. For a second, I thought I'd imagined it, but when I looked into his eyes, there was no mistaking the terror. The room fell silent. David and Megan had stopped mid-sentence. Their faces changed, not confusion, but something sharper, harder. The only sound was the faint crackle of the candles. I tried to breathe, but the air felt too thick. I looked at Ethan again, his fingers still gripping mine. He looked so small, yet in that moment, he was the only one brave enough to speak the truth. I slowly placed my fork down and turned to my son. "What's going on?" I asked quietly. He blinked, his smile frozen in place, and for the first time I saw it, the mask slipping, the warmth fading from his eyes. No one spoke, not a single word. I could feel my pulse in my throat, every instinct screaming that something was terribly wrong. And that's when I knew Ethan wasn't imagining things. Something real, something dangerous, was unfolding right there at that dinner table. And I had just become part of it. For a moment, everything stood still. David's stare, Megan's smile, Ethan's trembling hand still gripping mine. My thoughts tangled in disbelief, but something deep inside me, an old instinct I hadn't needed in years, told me to stay calm. I forced a weak laugh and reached for my glass, pretending nothing was wrong. "I think the wine's gone to my head," I said lightly, pushing my chair back. "I just need a minute." Megan's smile tightened. "Of course, Mom," she said, voice syrupy sweet. "Bathroom's down the hall. Take your time." David's eyes followed me as I stood. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I could feel it, that silent tension, the kind that prickled at the back of your neck. I walked slowly, steadying myself on the back of a chair until I turned the corner. Then I moved faster. I didn't go toward the bathroom. I went straight for the back door. My hand shook as I unlatched it quietly, stepping out into the cool night. The air hit me like a slap, sharp, cold, real. I pressed my back against the side of the house, my pulse pounding in my ears. The kitchen window was slightly open, and that's when I heard it. Megan's voice, low and sharp. "Once she drinks it, the paperwork will be easier. You said it yourself, David." My heart stopped. I froze, my hand clutched over my mouth. David's reply came quick, harsh. "Keep your voice down. Ethan's already acting weird." I could feel my stomach turn. My knees went weak. They weren't talking about some harmless paperwork. They were talking about me, about what would happen after I drank what was in that glass. Every memory, every uneasy look, every fake smile, it all made sense now. The documents they'd asked me to sign, the forced dinners, the sudden kindness. It was never about family. It was about control, about money, about what I had left. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay quiet. My hands trembled, but I couldn't afford to panic. I needed to think, to move. And then I thought of Ethan, my sweet boy, sitting alone at that table, surrounded by people who no longer felt like family. I couldn't leave him there. I pulled out my phone, my fingers shaking, and sent him a quick text. "Sweetheart, meet me by the back door. Don't ask questions." Every second felt like an hour. I crouched low, listening for footsteps, praying he'd understood. Then, faintly, I heard it, the soft creak of the back hallway floorboards, the careful steps of small feet. The door opened just enough for him to slip through. His face was pale, eyes wide. "Grandma," he whispered. "Are we?" I didn't let him finish. "Sweetheart, we have to leave right now. Don't ask questions." I grabbed his hand, and we ran across the yard, through the side gate, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. The night felt endless, but every step away from that house felt like air filling my lungs again. We reached my car parked near the end of the driveway. My hands shook so much I almost dropped the keys. Ethan climbed into the back seat, eyes darting toward the house. "They're going to see us," he whispered. "Shh," I said, turning the ignition. "Not if we move now." The engine hummed to life, quiet but strong. I didn't look back as we pulled away, but I could feel it, that house fading in the rearview mirror like a bad dream that wasn't quite over. I drove through the dark, headlights slicing through the night, Ethan clutching his stuffed bear tight. My phone buzzed once, David's name flashing on the screen. I ignored it. Then again, I turned it off. After what felt like forever, the small porch light of my old friend Nora's house appeared in the distance. Safe ground. I parked in her driveway, exhaling for the first time in what felt like hours. When she opened the door, her face went from surprise to concern in an instant. "What happened?" she asked. I couldn't even find the words. I just pulled Ethan close and whispered, "We can't go back." Inside, with the doors locked and the lights low, I finally allowed myself to feel it. The fear, the disbelief, the relief. Ethan sat beside me, small and silent, holding my hand tight. I looked down at him and realized that his warning had saved both our lives. If you're watching this right now, remember sometimes danger wears a familiar face. And sometimes the voice that saves you comes from the smallest person in the room. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. Even after locking every door and drawing every curtain in Nora's house, I still felt like they could reach me. I sat at her kitchen table, the same table where we used to drink tea and gossip about our neighbors, but that night every sound made me jump. The hum of the refrigerator, the wind brushing against the glass, everything felt like a threat. Nora sat across from me, her eyes wide and wet with worry. "You have to call the police," she said firmly. "You can't just sit here shaking, hoping this goes away." I wanted to argue, to say maybe it wasn't what it seemed, maybe I'd misunderstood. But the words I'd overheard at that window kept playing back in my mind. Once she drinks it, the paperwork will be easier. I looked at Ethan, sleeping on the couch wrapped in a blanket, his small chest rising and falling peacefully. I knew I couldn't protect him alone anymore. So I picked up the phone and dialed. My voice cracked when the dispatcher answered. Within the hour, the faint blue glow of police lights filled Nora's driveway. 2 detectives stepped in, calm, composed, but sharp-eyed. I told them everything. Every uneasy glance, every strange request, every word I'd heard through that kitchen window. They listened without interrupting, taking notes as my voice trembled through the details. When I finished, one of them leaned forward and said quietly, "Ma'am, you did the right thing." They sent a unit to the house immediately. I sat by the window, gripping my teacup with both hands, watching the reflection of those flashing lights blur in the glass. Time felt like it had stopped. Then, my phone rang an officer from the scene. His voice was calm, professional, but his words made my stomach twist. They'd found the bottle, the wine I hadn't finished. Forensics on-site confirmed traces of a sedative mixed in. Enough to knock someone out or worse, depending on how much I'd drunk. I closed my eyes, tears rolling down my cheeks before I could stop them. Within the hour, David and Megan were in custody. Witnesses said Megan had started shouting when the police arrived, accusing them of trespassing, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But the more she spoke, the more tangled her story became. When they took her downtown, it didn't take long before the truth came out. Under pressure, she broke down and confessed. They'd forged my will, everything from my signature to the notary stamp. The plan was simple. Once I passed peacefully after dinner, they'd file it the next morning and take the house, the retirement funds, everything I'd worked my whole life for. When the detective told me that, my heart shattered in a way I didn't think it could anymore. It wasn't just about the money. It was about trust. The son I had raised, to be honest, the daughter-in-law I had welcomed into my home, they'd looked me in the eye and planned my end over dinner. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Nora wrapped her arms around me, whispering that I was safe now, that justice would follow. But safety felt like a word that didn't belong to me anymore. The next morning, I asked the detective about Ethan. They told me he was under temporary protective custody until everything was sorted out. I drove to the Child Services office that afternoon. They let me see him through a glass window. He ran up and pressed his small hands against it, eyes filling with tears when he saw me. I pressed mine back, smiling even as my vision blurred. "I'm okay," I mouthed, though the lump in my throat made it hard to breathe. He nodded, but I could see the guilt in his face, as if he thought any of this was his fault. I shook my head gently, trying to tell him without words that he had saved me. That without him, there wouldn't have been another sunrise for either of us. That night, back at Nora's house, I sat in silence for a long time. Justice had begun, yes, but nothing about it felt like victory. My son was in jail, his wife facing charges, and my grandson caught in the middle of a storm he never asked to be part of. Yet somewhere beneath the heartbreak, I felt something else: gratitude. Gratitude that a 7-year-old had been brave enough to tell the truth when the adults around him wouldn't. Gratitude that I'd listened. If you're still watching this, I want you to remember one thing. Sometimes danger doesn't come from strangers. It comes from people who know exactly how to make you trust them. Never ignore your instincts, and never silence the little voice that tells you something isn't right. Because one day, it might save your life, just like Ethan's whisper saved mine. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and cold marble, and every sound echoed as if the walls themselves were listening. I sat quietly on the wooden bench, hands folded in my lap, my heart heavy but steady. Months had passed since that night, and yet the memory of Ethan's trembling voice still replayed in my mind. The trial had drawn curious eyes from the whole town, neighbors, old friends, even church members who whispered behind their hands but pretended to smile when they saw me. When they called my name to testify, my knees wobbled, but I stood tall. I told the court exactly what happened: the dinner, the whispers, the bottle, and the look in my grandson's eyes when he realized something terrible was about to happen. My voice didn't shake. I owed him that much. Across the room, David sat with his lawyers, staring down at his hands. He wouldn't look at me. Not once. Megan sat beside him, mascara streaking her cheeks, sobbing into a tissue that never seemed to run dry. But even from across the room, I could tell those tears weren't for me, they were for herself. When the prosecutor presented the evidence, the lab results, the forged will, the recorded confession from Megan's interview, the room fell silent. Every secret they had hidden under the surface of our perfect family was laid bare for the world to see. The detective who had handled my case testified next, and his words hit hard. If Mrs. Thompson had taken one more full glass of that wine, we might be telling a very different story. I saw a few jurors shift uncomfortably in their seats. The defense tried to argue that it was all a misunderstanding, that maybe Megan had mixed up the bottles, that maybe David didn't know what she'd done. But the handwriting expert's testimony destroyed their case completely. The signature on the fake will matched David's, not Megan's. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty on all counts. I closed my eyes, letting the words wash over me like cold rain. Megan let out a strangled cry. David's shoulders slumped. His head bowed as if he'd aged 20 years in a second. I wanted to feel joy, relief, victory. But all I felt was a hollow ache where love used to live. That was the moment I realized I hadn't just lost my family, I'd lost what they had become. Afterward, the judge called me forward. His voice softened as he said, "Mrs. Thompson, your courage and your grandson's bravery prevented a tragedy. You both saved each other." For a moment, the courtroom blurred through my tears. Ethan sat in the front row beside his caseworker, his little hand clutching mine as I passed. He gave me a small, brave smile, the kind that reminded me that goodness still existed, even after everything had fallen apart. When the judge granted me full control of my home, my accounts, and every asset they had tried to steal, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. Not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that lets you breathe again. As we walked out of the courthouse, the reporters called my name, but I didn't stop. I just wanted to go home, to the real home. The one filled with Ethan's laughter and the smell of cookies baking in the oven, not the place that had become a stage for betrayal. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds. Ethan slipped his small hand into mine and said, "Grandma, are we really free now?" I looked down at him, my throat tight, and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, we are." He smiled then, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, and I realized that no verdict could ever undo what he had given me a second chance to live. If you've ever trusted the wrong people, if you've ever sat across a table and felt something wasn't right but ignored it for love's sake, learn from this. Trust your instincts, protect your peace, because sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the very ones you need to guard your heart from. And when that moment comes, may you have the strength to walk away before it's too late. The days after the trial passed quietly, like soft ripples over still water. My house, once filled with tension and whispered plans, now carried only the sound of laughter, Ethan's laughter. The air felt lighter. The rooms no longer echoed with suspicion or fear. Every morning, I'd wake to the smell of pancakes and the sight of sunlight pouring through the kitchen window, touching the old photographs on the wall. Some faces in those frames would never look the same to me again, but I stopped hiding them away. They were part of my story, a reminder of both love and lesson. Sometimes, when I sat in my garden with Ethan beside me, I'd think about how quickly trust can turn into a weapon when placed in the wrong hands. I never imagined my own son could be capable of such cruelty. But I also never imagined a 7-year-old boy, my grandson, could be the one to save my life. Life has a strange way of balancing itself. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted everything in shades of gold, Ethan handed me a small seed packet. "Grandma," he said, his voice bright and sure, "let's plant something new, something just for us." I smiled, my heart swelling with something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. We knelt side by side in the soft soil, our hands dirty, our hearts clean. Every seed we pressed into the ground felt like a promise that no matter how much darkness we had endured, there would always be light waiting to bloom again. As I watched him laugh, his hair glowing in the sunset, I thought to myself, sometimes the people you raise become strangers. But love, true love, it finds its way back. Ethan reminded me that innocence can see what greed hides, that the smallest act of courage can change everything. He was my reminder that family isn't built on last names or inheritance papers. It's built on care, loyalty, and the quiet moments where hearts choose each other again. Now, when I tell this story, I don't tell it with bitterness. I tell it with gratitude, because surviving betrayal didn't just save my life, it gave me a new one. So if you ever find yourself sitting in a room where something feels off, where your heart whispers run, but your mind says stay, listen to that whisper. Trust your instincts. They might just save your life too. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. And remember, family isn't who shares your blood, it's who shares your heart.